Is Russia collapsing? The war is destroying it. Someone has rightly said, if we don't end the war will end us. There is still no sign of an end to the war in Ukraine and Russia after more than 9 months of warfare. Countless citizens are unable to go back to their homes. Many still in the nation are forced to survive without access to food, water, healthcare, and other necessary commodities. While the battle has been tragic for Ukraine and its people, it has also been disastrous for Russia in terms of its military, economy, and geopolitical position. The conflict has significantly injured Russia's military, degraded its image, impacted the economy, and fundamentally changed the geopolitical landscape that Moscow faces in Europe. To better comprehend the situation that Russia is currently experiencing, let's examine each case in the field of combat. By 2020, Mr. Putin vowed to make Russia a desirable country to live in, among other things. Conversely, countless numbers of Russians have emigrated to the West. Russia's economy is still heavily reliant on oil and natural gas, and since 2013, the gross domestic product per person has decreased by about 60%. The Kremlin's military deployment for its war in Ukraine has forced more than 300,000 Russians to depart the nation, despite government attempts to stem the demographic decline. Non-Russians from isolated and underdeveloped regions in the east and south make up a large portion of those unable to flee or pay bribes to get out of the conscription. Surely, the effects of the war are drastic, so without further ado, let's get into the specifics. Companies' exodus. The most evident disaster caused by Putin's invasion of Ukraine is and will be economic. By the 7th week of battle, more than 1,000 foreign corporations had scaled back or stopped down operations in Russia, according to researchers at Yale Business School. More will undoubtedly come. While the closure of Aston Martin or Burberry won't have much of an impact on the majority of Russians, the lack of maintenance and replacement parts from firms like Apple, Bombardier, Boeing, DuPont, Ericsson, Intel, and Analog Devices will have an impact on consumer spending, productivity growth, and eventually the supply and manufacturing chain of Russian industry. People becoming jobless. Additionally, hundreds of thousands more Russians will be jobless as a result of their exodus. Longer term, with Putin and the Duma threatening to take any residual assets of corporations that have hastily departed Russia, few foreign investors will return anytime soon. It painfully reminds me of what the Russian economy experienced after the Bolsheviks took control in 1917. Russian billionaires are also in the pain. Yes, some of Russia's super rich are unable to enter their ships and homes in Zurich, London, or Rome. They are now unable to travel outside of Russia with their families or send their children to school abroad. These are hardships, but the freezing and seizure of their assets in foreign banks hurts more. Despite this, they will survive as long as they continue to support Putin and accept the fact that they will have to live in Russia for the rest of their lives. Sanctions threaten to thrust Russia's economy back in time. The mission of Russian economic revitalization, which has advanced in fits and turns over the past 3 decades, will come to a stop as a result of the sanctions' repercussions on the country's overall economy. Foreign investment was already modest and will continue to be so. Since there are numerous alternative sources of oil, and it is a product that can easily be transported from elsewhere, Europe will eventually wean itself off its reliance on Russian oil and even its heaviest reliance on Russian natural gas. Liquefied natural gas terminals will, of course, take 2 or 3 years to build, particularly in Germany. But once they are, European consumers will probably never have to purchase natural gas from Russia again. Russia, an unreliable supplier. Russia's untrustworthy vendor status has been established beyond any reasonable question under Putin's incompetent leadership. As gas prices continue to climb, the changeover will be detrimental to Europe in the short run. However, those who will suffer the most in the long run are the Russian people and their economy. The European market is permanently closed, taking with it vital funding for the Russian budget. Will Russia now follow in the footsteps of others? Sales of automobiles have plunged by 60% as compared to the same period in 2021. And by September, the auto industry's output was down 77% year over year. The dependence of Russian businesses on Western components is a major factor. Even Vladimir Putin said last week that up to 90% of some industries' pieces depend on imports, which shows how serious the issue is. Even Russia's police will find it challenging to get new patrol cars due to the slowdown in auto manufacturing. The Interior Ministry has been unable to identify a supplier for the 2,800 new cars necessary for the traffic police, according to the Russian publication Kommersant. In order to adapt, Mr. Inozemtsev claimed that Russia is going home, severing relations with the rest of the world and adopting an economic system similar to that of Iran, where governmental legitimacy is based on meeting residents' basic needs rather than promoting transformational growth. Russia is not the only one. The whole of Central Asia is collapsing. The conflict between Russia and Ukraine caused significant geopolitical instability and a wide range of issues in the world economy. Prices for energy and agricultural goods have started to increase since the start of the conflict. Different geographical areas are impacted differently by global economic turmoil. Central Asia is one of the most significant regions impacted by the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The rising cost of essentials like food, clothes, petrol, and other necessities is a major worry for the inhabitants of Central Asia. According to respondents from Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan in the CAB Survey Wave 11 sample, 18.6% and 24.8% respectively believe that one of the unfavorable effects of conflict will be a rise in the cost of essential necessities. People's thoughts regarding rising costs mirror reality. Due to inflation, the cost of living in the area has increased since the commencement of the conflict. The regional inflation rate, according to the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, EBRD, is still around 16%. Putin's exodus. This extensive and yet unfinished list of Russian financial harm will continue to erode all of Russia's healthcare and demographic advances before the February assault. Gains earned despite, not because of, Putin's leadership. By 2018 or so, population growth has slowed down, reverting to the demographic disaster of the late Soviet period in 1990s. But Putin's invasion of Ukraine has expedited what had previously been termed the Putin exodus of educated young professionals that began after 2015. Midway through March, the BBC claimed that up to 15,000 Russians had already arrived in Georgia, while others had fled to Turkey and Armenia due to the closure of the airspace to Europe and North America to Russian planes. According to one estimate, up to 200,000 Russians may have left their nation in the first 4 weeks of the conflict. Since the Russian invasion, restrictions on cyberspace have also significantly increased. In the early weeks of the conflict, 80 million Instagram users in Russia had to bid the social network farewell. The site was shut down by the Russian government after Facebook and Twitter failed to comply with requests that they stop attempting to restrict official Russian state media. Russian military. The Russian military's appalling performance, which included a failed effort to conquer Kyiv in the first month of the war, and an estimated 15,000 losses in the first 7 weeks of fighting, roughly the same number suffered during the 9 years of the Soviet battle in Afghanistan. Despite a costly and comprehensive military reform in the previous decade, Russia will lose this conflict against the considerably smaller, far less well-equipped Ukrainian defensive forces. The Second World War Soviet warriors must be laughing in the afterlife right now. Putin has enabled widespread corruption in the Russian political system, which has weakened that country's military might. While preparing to deploy in Belarus, soldiers and commanders alike allegedly sold off their equipment. They have robbed Ukrainians of their belongings, taking as much as they can, and taking it back to Russia. Russians are being transported back in time to a time when Soviet residents lived cut off from the rest of the world, in a cocoon of failing ideology and false information, 3 decades after the fall of the Soviet Empire. That system collapsed precisely because of the autarky and authoritarianism that Putin wants to re-establish. Putin is failing Russia in a similar way that the Soviet Union failed, wiping all the advantages made during the post-communist era in a hapless effort to revive a dying empire. If you liked the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Also, subscribe to our channel. Until next time.